Life in Sointula, BC has always depended on the life in the water around Malcolm Island. For generations, fishing created the jobs. Not anymore.
We need something there. At the moment, we have basically nothing.
Sointula's survival now rests with another marine resource, abalone, a one-legged sea creature that could help get Sointula back on its feet. Certainly, that's what David Johnstone believes.
It represents the potential for millions of dollars of income.
Johnstone and his partner, Meg Wheeler, have taken up the challenge of turning that potential into reality. It will be a rocky journey, laced with anger, frustration, and criminal charges.
We don't have anything to lose. We have no options here anymore. If we don't have that primary business, this island as we know it will die.
The story began 2 years ago when Wheeler and Johnstone first heard of a federal project, one that would allow, for the first time, abalone farming in BC.
It's always something that's been in the back of our heads because it's so lucrative, it's so labor intensive, and it's a benign way to do aquaculture.
Abalone were harvested in BC until 10 years ago. Since then, they've been off limits because overfishing made them a threatened species. It's a story Johnstone knows all too well from his years as an abalone diver.
Well, I guess we pretty well wiped them out. I know in the later years particularly, the effort that was going into it was enormous. It'd be freezer boats with lots of divers working up and down the coast. And just a size limit alone wasn't going to save the species.
It was another example of a fishery mismanaged and closed. Another sour episode in the relationship between coastal communities like Sointula and the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. To make matters worse, the fishing ban didn't help the abalone. Their populations are now about half what they were 10 years ago.
Closing it to commercial just opened it to poaching. So as far as the abalone was concerned, the fishing pressure remained on the stock and continues to this day. One abalone is probably worth about $10. And if a guy's got to make a mortgage payment or something, that's not too bad. 100 pounds, $1,000.
So now the DFO was looking for partners to try to rebuild wild stocks through abalone farming. Johnstone knew from the start it would be a difficult alliance.
It was the only game in town, so you either bid on it or you don't.
Sointula bid and won on the strength of an underwater survey of abalone near Malcolm Island. There were enough that some could be harvested for aquaculture without hurting the wild stocks. And so the Malcolm Island Shellfish Cooperative was born. $50,000 in seed money from the province, a $250,000 provincial loan, and a federal department making the rules. The paperwork is proof of that.
Tons. And it's not just paper, it's long phone calls. It's driving down to meetings in Nanaimo or Campbell River.
Meg Wheeler is secretary-treasurer of the 75-member cooperative.
The old adage about many hands making light work.
David Johnstone is general manager.
I think the idea at this point is just to get stuff growing.
Outside the small office, the co-op has invested in a collection of tanks that will be a nursery for the new abalone.
In a year's time, this will all be weather beaten, and the abalones will love it.
It's a system based on an Australian model developed by Daryl Evans, a biologist and businessman.
You have to clean all the sheets to make sure they're right for the abalone, and when we put the larvae on it, they don't get smothered with the algae and they've got enough to eat.
There's a huge amount of promise on this small lot. If Australia's experience is any indication, 60 full and part-time jobs could be created, enough to replace what's been lost in Sointula's salmon fishing fleet, and help other coastal communities as well.
We have to produce how-to manuals, we have to produce courses, we have to do what the government likes to call capacity building so that we can transfer this technology to other communities.
We've pumped about $500,000 of the taxpayers' money into it so far.
But it will cost millions more and take at least 4 years before a single abalone goes to market. The project desperately needs private investment, and it can't get it because of the latest disagreement with the DFO. The co-op is not allowed to take any broodstock from the wild until a contract is signed with the federal department. A contract that includes donating as much as 50% of any abalone produced to help restock the wild. And the cooperative has no right of access to the broodstock after the 18-month pilot project is over. Wheeler and Johnstone believe those terms guarantee this project will fail.
We can't get private investment to invest in this project unless DFO removes these stumbling blocks. They just won't do it. So at the end of 18 months, the broodstock goes back and the pumps shut down, and that's the end of it.
It's not an end they're willing to accept. So in late July, the co-op tries to turn up the political heat when Fisheries Minister Herb Dhaliwal accepts an invitation to visit the hatchery. Johnstone brought up some abalone for the visit, knowing the DFO would not approve. He hoped it would force the federal agency's hand, that the co-op would be allowed to keep the abalone and begin farming. He was wrong. The tactic made local headlines twice. Once when the minister visited, and again a few days later when local fisheries officers seized the abalone and charged David Johnstone.
They were told to look for and seize any abalone that were in the hatchery. And they were told to lay charges against me for picking them in the first place.
That seizure quickly became the talk of Sointula Harbor.
What do you think of that old Dhaliwal coming to town and blessing all this abalone operation? The next day the enforcement officers come and seize all the abalone, for God's sakes. 20 of the bloody things. Jesus. Perfect. My God, politicians.
But local outrage was not going to put abalone into the empty hatchery. Only a new deal with the DFO could do that.
DFO initiated this project, but they are our single biggest stumbling block to seeing it succeed. It makes no sense.
The Department of Fisheries and Oceans is more concerned about restoring stocks of a threatened species than restoring hope in Sointula. Officials don't want to make any long-term decisions about coastal resources, such as abalone broodstock, without having a policy that reflects the interests of everyone involved. Now, developing that policy could take a year or more, and that's a year that Sointula doesn't have. In fact, the co-op has just weeks to get things started. The abalone spawning season in the waters around Sointula is almost over.
That's the ticking clock. Give it another month, we've lost it.
So a desperate David Johnstone decides he will defy the DFO again by bringing up more abalone, with Country Canada's camera there to document the event.
It makes sure that this is a political statement, not just a poaching activity. It gives it the sort of high profile that any judge is going to wonder about if I get charged with poaching at some point in the future.
We do need government support in this thing.
But that political statement is derailed in an emergency meeting of the co-op board.
We still need access to those broodstock, a percentage of them, right away.
They all share Johnstone's frustration, but will defying the DFO again help or hurt? Just today, the agency has offered an olive branch of sorts, a letter that indicates but does not promise support for a commercial enterprise.
The way it sounds to me is that if we don't sign it, we're dead in the water anyways.
We have to come to a conclusion on this really soon. We're going to lose our biologist here, and we aren't going to be able to afford to bring him back next year.
As the meeting closes, the board decides to explain the new letter of support to their potential investors and not take any more abalone without DFO approval.
At some point, we have to have a little bit of trust.
Johnstone is not convinced that will save the project, but he's not convinced defying DFO will help his community either.
Yeah, we haven't put all this work into it just to have some frivolous confrontation. Not only that, but I've got no criminal record whatsoever, so I don't undertake these activities lightly. I don't want a criminal record. Yeah, our backs are against the wall.
This is the last hurrah. This is our swan song. If this fails, we're toast.
A week later, the weather is gray, but the mood is anything but.
I can't stand the suspense any longer.
The DFO's indication of support is enough to keep the co-op's private investors on board. David Johnstone is finally allowed to take the broodstock his community needs. But he's still facing charges for the first collection.
I don't know why everything has to be so bloody difficult. It's such a good idea, and it should be simple, but it's not. But I really don't understand it.
A DFO observer is on hand, as well as a welcoming committee for the abalone, on boats and on shore.
Here you go.
They watch as a handful of abalone are taken from the water. The first small steps towards a new future for Sointula. There are no guarantees it will work, but now at least there's a chance.
It meant that there was hope, that after losing so much in the salmon industry and so many people unemployed, that it was the beginning, a new beginning, and one that was desperately needed.
For Country Canada, I'm Jim McCory in Sointula, BC.